what I consider to be very interesting research into marijuana's effect on the brain. Kara probably is going to disagree about how interesting or how new it is. It's being presented here as new. Coming from a study that was published just in June in Biological Psychiatry. It's one of the magazines we have in our lounge. So
they call it a journal.
Exactly, yeah.
A periodical.
No, it's a magazine.
Okay.
But yeah, so they're talking about the effect of marijuana long-term on motivation and things like that. So we have a brief description of the study. They say the long-term cannabis users in this study tended to produce less dopamine, a feel-good chemical in the brain that plays an important role in motivation and reward-driven behavior. Furthermore, study participants who smoked marijuana regularly or started at a younger age had lower levels of dopamine in a part of the brain called the striatum, which could be why cannabis users appear to lack motivation. Have you heard of dopamine before?
I've heard of dopamine.
Okay,
so two things on that. I hate that they're calling it a feel-good chemical. That's like so, I hate it when people do that. And also, it's the striatum. Sorry. So, but this is, no, you know what? This is interesting.
I tried, okay? That's the first time I've ever seen that word.
Because it shows a neurochemical basis for something that we have known for a long time. I remember in undergrad, striatum, and my master's, I went to the same school. I went to the University of North Texas, and I did an undergrad in psychology and a master's in neurobiology. And somewhere along the way, I took a course called neuropsychopharmacology, like you do.
Yeah, that's one of my gen eds I took.
You know, and in the neuropsychopharm textbook, I remember reading about cannabis. It was always really interesting to me. I smoked a lot of weed in college, and I thought that, you know, I wanted to really get to the real science behind how it affects your brain. And I remember one of the symptoms listed, or the side effects listed, was chronic immotivation syndrome, which, you know, I guess is classified.
Case of the Mondays.
Yeah, you know. And it's funny because this study, or this article at least, says that, you know, it quotes the lead author, Michael Bloomfield, and he says whether such a syndrome exists is controversial. And I could see that because maybe previous to this, they didn't really have any sort of like neurochemical markers of it. They actually expected people to have spikes or irregularities in dopamine because
in their striatum.
In the striatum.
Yeah.
Because we know that, you know, smoking weed actually is classified, it's classified as a hallucinogen, and anybody who's eaten pot instead of just smoking it has experienced the hallucinogenic effects of pot. So the issue here is that, you know, they were expecting that there would be more dopamine released in individuals because that's a similar pattern to what we see in people with schizophrenia. And there does seem to be kind of a weird link between, you know, certain drugs, but especially hallucinogenic drugs, and schizophrenia. You know, specifically we talk about acid or mushrooms, that's really obvious, but there does seem to be a link somewhat between cannabis use. And so when I was studying, back when I worked for HuffPost, I did a piece on 420, of course, about cannabis, but it was for the science pages. So I interviewed a scientist at UCSD, I think, and talked to him specifically about symptoms and, you know, is cannabis actually addictive? What does it do to the brain? And the big thing that he kept saying over and over was that it doesn't seem to have real lasting effects. It doesn't seem to have withdrawal symptoms. But we need to be wary about cannabis use in individuals who are younger than maybe 17, 18.
The final point I want to make on this is that underlying any discussion we have of both positive or negative health effects of marijuana, because it's illegal in America, there's always the next step, well, should this make it more likely that we legalize it? But don't pay attention to that. The legality of marijuana should not be contingent on whether or not it's good or bad for you. High fructose corn syrup is perfectly legal. Drinking as much vodka as you want, as long as you don't drive, is legal. That's a totally separate question from the legality issue. But anyway, so interesting study.
Good point.